A fine rain fell over London, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away the city's sins. Through the shadows of the damp alleys, a black carriage moved in silence, drawn by two coal-dark horses that seemed to leave no trace behind. Inside, a young man with restless eyes clutched a sealed invitation in his hands. Heavy parchment, gilded edges, a wax seal stamped with the royal crest. The driver, a man in a low-brimmed hat with an unreadable face, hadn't spoken a single word the entire journey. The only sound was the steady, metallic rhythm of hooves striking wet cobblestone. When the carriage finally stopped before a grand mansion hidden behind towering wrought-iron gates, the young man stepped down and was greeted by a butler in white gloves, his eyes cold and unblinking. No name was asked. No credentials required. Only a silent gesture, bidding him inside. The air within smelled of candle wax and aged wine. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light over a vast ballroom where lords and ladies danced to the strains of a string quartet. Yet, something felt wrong. Behind the heavy curtains, shadowed figures watched. Lingering stares. Smiles that never touched the eyes. At the center of the room, a tall man in a crimson tailcoat, his chest glittering with medals, raised a crystal glass. His voice carried authority, and something else, a thread of menace. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight the king wishes to meet the chosen." A heavy silence fell. The young man tightened his grip on the invitation. And for the first time he noticed there was no music filling the air. At 19, he had never set foot outside Covent Garden. The son of a ruined merchant, he knew the sting of hunger and the crushing weight of debt. But nothing could have prepared him for the invitation that now burned in his hands. Heavy parchment, gilded edges, the royal seal in red wax. A summons no ordinary man would receive, unless there was a reason or a hidden price. The driver hadn't spoken a single word. His face stayed hidden beneath the brim of his hat, and the only music on the journey was the rhythm of hooves on the slick pavement. When the carriage stopped before an ornate iron gate, Thomas felt a chill trace his spine. The gate swung open on its own, groaning as though it were alive. Beyond it, the mansion rose in quiet dominance, lit only by candelabras glowing in its windows. The butler who received him wore white gloves and a severe, expressionless face. No name asked. No introductions. Only a curt gesture to step inside. The main hall was a beauty so perfect it almost suffocated. Crystal chandeliers bathed polished marble floors in golden light, and a string quartet played a slow, almost mournful melody. Men and women in immaculate formal attire moved with studied grace. But there was something unsettling in the way their eyes lingered on each newcomer. Between the columns and deep crimson velvet drapes, figures watched, some with curiosity, others with a calculating coldness. Thomas noticed that the younger guests, all dressed to perfection, did not join the dancing. They stood along the edges of the room, like pieces waiting to be moved on someone else's chessboard. At the center, a tall man in a crimson coat, his medals catching the light like tiny blades, lifted a glass. His smile was broad, but his eyes were sharp as cut glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight His Majesty wishes to meet the chosen." The murmur that rippled through the ballroom was like a sudden, icy wind. The quartet fell silent. The last notes seemed to dissolve into a heavy, suffocating stillness. Thomas felt his throat tighten. As the man in the red coat descended the steps, two guards emerged from the shadows, taking their positions near the doors, not to welcome guests, but as if to make sure no one left. A light touch on his shoulder made Thomas turn. A woman of aristocratic beauty, draped in blue silk and wearing a string of pearls, was staring at him with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You're new," she said in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "Enjoy every moment of this night, it might be your last." Before he could reply, she vanished between the columns. At the top of the grand staircase, the door to the court's private chambers swung open. A hooded figure beckoned the first of the chosen. Thomas noticed that each of them hesitated before climbing the steps, and that none of them returned. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 2 days earlier, Thomas Ainsworth had been sweeping the floor of the small warehouse where he worked for a friend of his father. Since the family business had collapsed, debt had turned his life into a quiet routine of underpaid labor and meager meals. A London winter was merciless for anyone without titles, land, or connections. That was the day a messenger appeared, dressed in a black tailcoat and tall hat. He spoke not a single word, merely handing over an envelope sealed with red wax and stamped with the royal crest. Thomas froze, staring at that piece of paper as if it were cursed. The note, written in immaculate script, read, Mr. Thomas Ainsworth, your presence is required at Wexford Hall on the 14th of this month for an event of singular importance. Formal attire required. Do not fail to attend. There was no signature, only a strange emblem. A crown intertwined with a serpent, a crest Thomas had never seen before. His first reaction was disbelief. Why would someone from the royal court summon the ruined son of a failed merchant? That evening, when he mentioned the invitation to his neighbor, a former soldier, the man gave him only a shadowed look and advice that didn't sound much like advice at all. If you go, remember that not everything in the court is gold. Some things are iron, and chains. The man said nothing more. On the night of the ball, Thomas rented a simple but well-tailored black coat from a tailor who turned pale at the sight of the invitation. Don't miss it. And don't be late, was all he said before closing the door. The carriage that came for him arrived at the exact appointed hour. The driver said nothing, asked nothing, explained nothing. He simply drove. And so, Thomas reached the mansion. Now, back in the ballroom, surrounded by calculating stares and smiles that hid more than they revealed, he struggled to understand his role in this night's strange theater. That was when she appeared, Lady Eleanor Whitmore. Tall, elegant, with dark hair pinned in place by silver combs and a blue gown that shimmered in the candlelight, she approached with the poise of someone who knew every eye in the room was on her. Thomas Ainsworth, she said, savoring the name. I knew your father, in a way he certainly never told you about. He raised his eyebrows, startled. And why am I here, my lady? Her smile became almost imperceptible. Because sometimes the crown requires loyalty and beauty, and you possess both. Before Thomas could answer, one of the guards stepped forward and whispered something in Lady Eleanor's ear. She nodded, then turned to him. It's your turn to climb the staircase. Don't look back. And whatever happens, don't say no. The words echoed in Thomas's mind as he began to ascend. Behind him, the ballroom seemed to drift farther away with each step. And at the top, the door to the private chambers waited, silent, like a predator ready to devour its prey. The staircase felt longer than it should have been. Every step rang like a warning, and the muffled sounds of conversation and music from the ballroom faded into nothing. Thomas felt the weight of every gaze following him. Not just Lady Eleanor's, but the eyes of other guests studying him as if he were some rare prize about to be auctioned off. At the top, a narrow hallway stretched out, lit by oil lamps mounted on walls draped with rich oriental tapestries. The air was warmer here, perfumed with incense and something else, a sweet, slightly cloying scent, as if meant to dull the senses. A man of average height, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tailcoat, stood waiting at the entrance to a smaller room. He smiled, though the expression never touched his eyes. Welcome to the Wexford Circle, he said, stepping aside. Please come in. The room was more intimate, lined with velvet sofas, heavy curtains, and gilded mirrors reflecting the glow of dozens of candles. Around 8 young men and women, all close to Thomas's age, were scattered about, some speaking in low voices, others silently observing, as if studying every detail around them. A blond young man with aristocratic features approached, his smile carrying a carefully practiced confidence. First invitation? He asked, offering Thomas a glass of wine. Thomas accepted but didn't drink. Something like that, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. And you? This is my third, the man said, leaning in a little closer. I'm Charles. You'll learn quickly that here, words matter less than glances. Before Thomas could ask what that meant, a young woman with warm brown skin and striking green eyes entered the room. She wore a red silk gown and walked as if every step were deliberately measured to draw attention. She approached Thomas and Charles, but kept her gaze locked on the newcomer. The new one, she said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper. Be careful with those who smile too much. Without introducing herself, she drifted away, leaving behind the heavy scent of jasmine and warning. That was when Thomas realized something unsettling. No one here spoke about the real reason they were gathered. The conversations circled around veiled compliments, memories of past banquets, and silences. Many silences. Suddenly, the door opened again. Lady Eleanor stepped inside, followed by a tall man with sharp features and a dark navy uniform adorned with gold insignia. Gentlemen, she began, her voice both firm and sweet, His Majesty will have the pleasure of receiving only 4 of you tonight. A murmur swept through the room. Charles shot Thomas a quick look. A wordless signal that here, everyone was competing, even if the prize remained a mystery. Lady Eleanor moved slowly among them, her eyes gliding over each person, as if she were a jeweler inspecting precious stones. When her gaze met Thomas's, she paused. A faint smile curved her lips, not of tenderness but of decision. "He'll be the first," she said, pointing to Thomas. "Follow me." As they walked back down the hallway, Thomas felt the growing pressure of that silent game. He didn't know the rules, but he was beginning to grasp the essence. In this place, a glance could be an invitation, a sentence, or a trap. And as he crossed the threshold into the royal chambers, he understood he was about to find out which of the three awaited him. The door closed behind him with a muted thud, shutting out the murmurs of the corridor. The room was spacious but not brightly lit. The walls were covered in deep red velvet drapes that swallowed the candlelight, casting a golden haze over everything. In the center lay a large Persian rug, surrounded by high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle. In the central seat, flanked by two advisors, sat the king. George III appeared frail, his body wrapped in heavy robes, white hair falling over a damp brow. Yet his eyes were sharp and alive, as if measuring Thomas inch by inch. "Step forward," said one of the advisors, a gaunt man with a narrow face and a thin mustache. Thomas walked toward them, feeling each step sink into the carpet, as if it were trying to pull him down. Lady Eleanor stood to his left, perfectly still, almost like a sentinel. "This is the young man I told you about, Your Majesty," she said, her voice soft yet steady. "Son of Ainsworth, a cloth merchant." The king inclined his head slightly. "Fine bearing," he murmured. "And eyes that don't lie, not yet." One of the advisors let out a quiet chuckle, but was silenced by a single gesture from the monarch. George III then raised his hand and pointed toward the side of the chamber, where a gilded screen hid part of the room from view. "Show him." Lady Eleanor led Thomas around the screen. Beyond it, the setting changed. Silk cushions scattered across the floor, silver trays piled with fruit and crystal goblets, and a heavy, intoxicating fragrance that seemed almost designed to overwhelm the senses. Three young people, 2 men and 1 woman, were seated there, speaking in low voices, laughing at something Thomas couldn't hear. When they noticed him, the conversation died, and all 3 regarded him with interest. "This is the new one," Lady Eleanor said. "Treat him well." But there was something in her eyes that told Thomas treat him well could mean many different things. From the other side of the screen, the king continued. "Here, young Ainsworth, there are no titles, no possessions. There is only loyalty and pleasure. One serves the other, and both serve the crown." Thomas kept his face composed, though his heart quickened. He didn't fully understand the weight of those words, but something deep inside told him that accepting them would mean surrendering something he could never get back. The young people in the corner approached. One of them, dark-haired with a sharp smile, spoke first. "The first night is always the hardest. After that, you learn how to play." The light touch of his hand on Thomas's shoulder seemed casual, almost friendly, but carried a quiet weight, as if marking the start of an unspoken pact. Lady Eleanor stepped forward. "His Majesty wishes to see you again at dawn. Until then, you'll remain here." And with that, the door closed. The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed like a sentence being handed down. In the dim light of the shadow room, Thomas understood he was already inside a game he could not simply walk away from. The night dragged on slowly in the shadow room. The distant sound of music and laughter from the grand ballroom had faded hours ago, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the soft crackle of candles and the occasional clink of glasses. Thomas sat on one of the silk cushions, quietly observing the others. They spoke to each other with ease, but there was something strange about their exchanges. No one mentioned the outside world, no one spoke of family, streets, or anything beyond the walls of this palace. The sharp-smiled young man, who had introduced himself as Edward, caught Thomas's watchful gaze. "Trying to figure out the rules?" he asked, pouring wine into Thomas's glass without waiting for an answer. "It's simple. In here, you belong to the king. And the king belongs to whoever controls him." Thomas frowned. "And if someone wants to leave?" Edward laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No one wants to. Or rather, no one can." He lowered his voice. "The moment you stepped inside, your life stopped being yours." A green-eyed young woman named Isabella moved closer, settling beside Thomas. Her sweet perfume seemed almost meant to cloud the mind. "You're new, so you still think you have a choice. I used to think that too, until I realized that if I disappeared, no one out there would ask questions." A chill slid down Thomas's spine. He was beginning to realize that the locked doors weren't just meant to keep strangers out. They were meant to keep everyone inside. Just before dawn, Lady Eleanor returned. Her posture was flawless, her smile controlled, but her eyes moved over each of them with a sharp, measuring gaze. "His Majesty will rest through the morning," she announced. "But that doesn't mean you're free." She handed Edward a small rolled parchment. He opened it, read in silence, and nodded. Then Lady Eleanor stepped closer to Thomas, her voice dropping low enough for only him to hear. "From this day on, your movements will be guided," she said. "You'll have company everywhere you go." Thomas drew in a deep breath, forcing himself to keep his composure. "That's surveillance." She tilted her head slightly. "No, it's protection." When Lady Eleanor left, Edward moved in again, locking eyes with Thomas. Protection, that's the word they use for chains you can't see. By midday, Thomas realized Edward was right. Even to walk into the inner garden, there was always a servant or guard coincidentally nearby. The windows were set too high to reach, and the doors always locked from the inside. That first morning, staring at London's grey sky through thick glass, Thomas understood that his freedom hadn't been stolen all at once. It had been replaced with a silent contract. And he was already paying the price. Night fell heavy over the mansion. Rain returned, drumming against the window panes like impatient fingers. In the shadow room, the young people still gathered, but the air was thicker than on previous nights. Something was hanging over them, an unease even the strongest wine couldn't dissolve. Edward was unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on the curtains that hid the entrance to the corridor. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low Thomas had to lean in to hear. "Tomorrow. I'm leaving." Thomas's eyes widened. "You said no one could leave." Edward gave a tight smile. "No one who follows the rules." He took a sip of wine. "I found a loophole." Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. "What loophole?" Edward glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Isabella was across the room, engaged in conversation with Charles. "There's a tunnel beneath the east wing. Old, from the time of Charles II. The entrance is behind the music room, hidden under the floorboards. Few people know about it, but I saw the butler go down there once." Thomas frowned. "And you think you can get through without being seen?" Edward leaned in closer. "Not alone." He paused. "Come with me." Before Thomas could respond, the door opened. Lady Eleanor entered, her deep green gown a striking contrast against her flawless pale skin. Her eyes swept the room like a beam of light searching for something, or someone. "Mr. Edward, His Majesty wishes to see you," she said, her voice steady. But her gaze lingered on Thomas a heartbeat longer than necessary. Edward stood, setting his glass on the table. As he passed Thomas, he murmured, "Think about my offer. This might be your only chance." When Edward was gone, Lady Eleanor remained still for a moment, watching Thomas as if she could read his every thought. Then she stepped forward, leaning in to speak in a tone soft, almost intimate. "He's dangerous. He'll try to drag you into his own ruin." Thomas held her gaze. "And why would that matter to you?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Because I need you to survive." She walked away without another word, but the sentence kept echoing in Thomas's mind. Who was telling the truth? Edward with his secret tunnel, or Lady Eleanor with her veiled warning? Hours later, Edward returned to the room. He didn't say where he'd been, but his expression was tense, and there was a thin cut along the side of his neck. At the sight of blood, Thomas knew something had happened, and that time to choose a side was running out. Outside, the storm roared, as if all of London were trying to warn them about what was coming. Inside the suffocating heat of the shadow room, Edward approached Thomas with careful, measured steps, avoiding attention. "It's tonight," he whispered. "The tunnels only open during the kitchen inspection, right before the guard change." Thomas stared at him, torn between the promise of freedom and the weight of Lady Eleanor's warnings. "And if it's a trap?" he asked. Edward gave a half-smile. "Then we die trying." A little before midnight, they seized a moment when Isabella kept the guards occupied with a piano performance. Edward led Thomas down a side corridor where the air grew cooler and damp. They slipped through a narrow door into a pantry, and from there into an empty music room. In the corner, a Persian rug concealed a slightly raised section of floor. Edward pulled it back, revealing a wooden hatch reinforced with iron. From his pocket, he produced a small key and unlocked it. "I thought no one could get out of here," Thomas murmured. "No one except those who know where to look," Edward replied. They descended a stone staircase into a narrow tunnel, lit only by the lantern Edward carried. The air was thick with damp earth, the scent of age and decay almost choking. The worn stone walls seemed to whisper the ghosts of past escapes. They walked for several minutes before a faint light appeared in the distance. Edward quickened his pace. That was when they heard it, footsteps behind them, firm, fast, deliberate. Before Thomas could react, voices rang out through the tunnel. "Stop! In the name of the king!" Edward threw the lantern to the ground, snuffing out the light, and shoved Thomas forward. "Run!" The tunnel erupted with shouts and the metallic clash of weapons. Thomas ran blindly, lungs burning with every breath. Behind him came the sound of bodies colliding and a muffled cry, "Edward." When he finally found a small exit, he tried to push it open, but it was locked from the outside. A hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around, expecting to see Edward, but found 2 guards instead. The blow came fast, and the world went black. When he woke, he was back in the shadow room. Lady Eleanor sat across from him, immaculate, as if the storm outside were nothing more than a distant rumor. "Edward tried to escape," she said flatly. "And now he's gone." Thomas drew a steady breath. "Are you going to tell me this is protection?" She tilted her head almost with pity. "I'm going to tell you that sometimes freedom costs more than life." The mansion was steeped in a dense, almost tangible tension. Since the previous night, the corridors seemed more heavily guarded, the glances more calculating. Edward's absence hung over the place like a shadow no one dared name. By late afternoon, Lady Eleanor entered the shadow room accompanied by 2 guards. She wore a black silk gown that shimmered under candlelight and carried a golden mask in her hands. "Tonight," she announced with an enigmatic smile, "we hold a masquerade ball in honor of His Majesty's health. But it will also be a night of choices." She handed the mask to Thomas. "The king trusts me. I trust you." She paused, stepping closer so only he could hear. "There is someone in this court working against the crown. If you help me find them, I will guarantee your freedom." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "And if it's you," he ventured. Lady Eleanor kept her smile, but her eyes hardened. "Then, I will deserve whatever fate awaits me." Hours later, the grand hall was unrecognizable. Red satin drapes hung from the walls, chandeliers glittered like constellations, and dozens of masked guests danced to the strains of a string ensemble. The air was one of absolute luxury, but underneath it all ran a dangerous current of anticipation. Wearing the golden mask, Thomas moved through the room, observing. He spotted Isabella in a silver gown speaking with a broad-shouldered man whose mask covered his entire face. He also saw Charles, who gave him a quick look, one that seemed to carry a message without words. At the center of the celebration, Lady Eleanor stood among a group of nobles, laughing with a carefully rehearsed lightness. But Thomas noticed something. Each time someone new approached, she subtly shifted her position, as if orchestrating exactly who could speak to whom. Suddenly, a hand pulled Thomas behind a marble column. It was Charles. "I heard what she told you," he whispered. "She's lying. Eleanor isn't hunting a traitor. She's eliminating the ones who know too much. Edward was just the first." Thomas scanned the room. "And why tell me this?" "Because I can get you out, but I'll need you to expose her tonight." The sharp chime of a glass striking interrupted them. The master of ceremonies announced that everyone should gather in the center of the hall. The king, supported by 2 advisors, was to make a toast. Lady Eleanor moved to Thomas's side, taking his arm gently, though with enough firmness to make retreat impossible. "It's time," she said. "The choice is yours." As the king raised his glass and all eyes turned toward him, Thomas realized he had only seconds to decide. Turn Lady Eleanor over, or betray Charles. The music stopped. The hall waited. The silence after the king's toast was thick, almost suffocating. Thomas felt the weight of dozens of stares, some curious, some suspicious, and a few, he was certain, eager for blood. Lady Eleanor's hand remained on his arm, her fingers cold as silver claws. A few paces away, Charles watched him with a look that was equal parts urgency and plea. The king, frail but still commanding, lifted his gaze to Thomas. "Mr. Ainsworth," he said, his voice rough but steady, "I'm told you hold information that could determine the fate of this court." Thomas's heart pounded. He could name Eleanor, fulfilling his promise to Charles. Or he could accuse Charles and secure what Eleanor had offered him, freedom. But as he looked at the monarch, he saw a third path, reckless, dangerous. He stepped forward, breaking free of Eleanor's grip. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice louder than he expected, "the true traitor is the one keeping this game of shadows alive, the one imprisoning and using young lives as bargaining chips while the kingdom rots outside these walls." A ripple of shock swept through the ballroom. Eleanor moved forward, but the king raised a hand to stop her. His eyes locked on Thomas, and a faint, almost nostalgic smile tugged at his weathered lips. "You remind me," he said with a long sigh, "of someone I loved in my youth. Someone who dared to defy me." The king gestured, and his advisors stepped back. With effort, he rose and crossed the floor toward Thomas. He came close enough that the scent of medicinal herbs and aged wine mingled in the air. "Don't think I'm unaware of what happens under this roof," he murmured, low enough for only Thomas to hear. "But a king chooses which chains to break." Then, to everyone's astonishment, the monarch placed his hands on either side of Thomas's face and pressed a light kiss to his forehead. "Tonight you are free," he declared to the entire hall. The reaction was instant. Eleanor's expression remained composed, but her eyes betrayed something between fury and respect. Charles, on the other hand, smiled as if he had just won a war. But freedom, as proclaimed, came with its own warning. As Thomas turned to leave, the king called him back and whispered, "Remember, boy, even a free man can carry chains no one else can see." And as he stepped out into the rain-washed streets of London, Thomas couldn't tell if he had just escaped or walked into a larger prison. The rain falling over the boulevard Saint-Germain reminded him of London's. But here the sound was softer, as if the city embraced melancholy with grace. Thomas Ainsworth now lived in a small, peeling-walled apartment above a bookshop. He had traded fine coats for simple shirts and grand balls for solitary nights in smoke-filled cafes. He worked as a translator of letters and documents for English merchants living in exile. It was a modest life, but a free one, or so he liked to believe. That afternoon, returning home, he found something unexpected. On the table sat an envelope sealed with red wax, the same crest he thought he'd never see again. A crown intertwined with a serpent. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside was a note, written in the same immaculate handwriting he remembered from years ago. "Mr. Ainsworth, some chains are never broken. They only change form. The game continues." Thomas's heart raced. Could be Eleanor or Edward. But Edward was dead, wasn't he? He sat down, staring at the letter as the rain outside grew heavier. The words of George III returned to him. "Even a free man can carry chains no one else can see." Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside his apartment. Slowly they drew closer. Then 3 firm knocks at the door. "Who is it?" Thomas called out, his voice more unsteady than he would have liked. "Silence." He rose, crossed the small room, and carefully opened the door. The hallway was empty, except for a dark wooden box, the same crest carved into its lid. When he opened it, he found inside a golden mask, the very one he had worn on the night of judgment. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind carried with it the distant sound of a string ensemble. The same melody played in the shadow room. Thomas closed his eyes and drew in a slow breath. He knew that somewhere, the pieces on the board were being moved again. And whether he wished it or not, he had just been summoned back into the game.